This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Today's ChangeMaker is Jason Geno. Jason is the president of Human Capital Initiatives. He works with the country's leading housing authorities and nonprofits to improve operational efficiencies and implement cost-saving procedures. Jason, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Katie. Appreciate it.
We've been focusing these podcasts on change makers, and I cannot think of a better guest to help us actually walk through even more detailed change making that is happening in affordable housing. We have so much to discuss today, but before we do, give our podcast listeners the context of your company.
Yeah, we started about 19 years ago, and honestly, we started in private sector. We worked with private sector nonprofits, property management companies, and we were introduced to a large public housing authority, our first client, to examine how to deal with inefficiencies, and they wanted a look and feel of a more private sector model. And from there, over 19 years ago, it took off. Ever since then, we've been working with small, medium, large housing authorities on human resources, management concerns, and technology.
So when you say that public organizations were wanting to look at private sector models, is that management practices?
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
It's looking at, first of all, people, how they're doing their work, processes, how processes are being done, how they're being carried out, and then the usage of technology. We have a background in both HR and technology, sort of an unusual approach. One word that really comes to mind and what we look at is a Japanese word called muta. And muta means wastefulness or non-value added. And what we do is we'll look at non-value added processes, areas in which processes can be tightened up, and how to better utilize the workforce. So if you're utilizing a specialized position, maybe that position could be more of a generalist, could take on more responsibilities and be more efficient in carrying out their duties.
And I'm sure that is probably greeted with a mixed bag of enthusiasm and conflict. For example, do you see, leadership wanting to and middle management not? Are there any generalizations there in that?
It's a rare occasion where we're brought in strictly for cost cutting. We're often brought in where management has had that conversation with middle management, executive and middle management, have talked about looking at a bigger picture overall of their operations. And if they haven't, we'll encourage that discussion. We want to go in a non-threatening manner because the information we gain from our interviews and the data collection overall is really critical, and it's paramount to have buy-in from that client. So we work with that client to make them feel more at ease and make the employees understand that the more information they give, the better it is for us to figure out how can their talents be used more efficiently. And we're seeing that more and more over the last 5-6 years, especially under RAD.
I'm sure most every company likes to boast about the implementation of efficiency or cost-saving procedures. What has been your favorite method to either recommend or see implemented?
Probably looking first at how workflows are being captured and utilized in the organization. We find that if an organization looks at their workflows first, they will find undoubtedly areas in which they can shrink the way that they're operating their process, looking at reducing touch points. All those areas and processes are inefficiencies. So without even touching the staffing or workforce component of it, but looking at the workflows first, how are we carrying out a process? Do we have too many touch points? That's one area that's really critical. In addition to that, are the operating procedures up to date? Do we all work with the same operating procedures, or we are operating very differently as each person have their own procedures, which again is an inefficiency.
Well, one of the successful collaboratives that Quadell and HCI, we've worked together. We've actually looked at a lot of those operational procedures with you
Mm-hmm.
and tried to minimize exposure to liability, operational risk, or even compliance gaps. And, that's been a unique thing because you see a lot of times people have implemented procedures that are off the books or, they've done things certain ways. And when you actually take the procedure mirrored with what their work study is,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes real obvious to see, okay, that's not what the regulations say, or that's not what your own policy says. So those do stand out clearly. One question is one of the critiques that often happens is how you're able to make those workflow process changes without sacrificing quality.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the best way that you see that those two things can cohabitate together?
The idea behind not sacrificing quality is critical, and we will often use our time study program to complement interviews with staff. Okay, and we'll look at the gaps that may exist after the time study program has been completed. And it's important to realize that we don't want to just cut workforce. We want to actually make workforce better, stronger, so they do
Right.
produce quality. We think that's what's important.
And then, you know what, I think of sometimes that, people are maybe not sure of the full scope, that balance of quality, efficiency, possibly cost savings, but maybe that, like you said, is not your original goal. And in your kickoff meetings that you do, walk us through how you present the scope of what you're about to do or the what you are wanting to achieve.
So interesting. When we often get a proposal to respond to, and we'll get accepted on a proposal, and I always talk to the stakeholders and say, listen, our first kickoff is really, what do you want to gain from this? Is it overall process efficiency? Is it using your staff better? So that first meeting is really critical for us because sometimes the words that they've described isn't always what they want to have captured at the end of the day. So we'll have a long meeting with them to actually go through each area to determine, is this more about process inefficiency, workforce inefficiency, and are there technology problems that are also causing angst in the agency? So having that dialogue and then reflecting, going back and summarizing that meeting and say, okay, we heard this, so it may even revise our scope a little bit. So that first meeting is really critical for sitting down and determining what their goals are and where they want to go with the assessments.
Can you tell us, this is sort of spilling the tea in some regards, as they say, but can you tell us what is one thing that you wish every management company or public housing agency would stop doing?
It's sort of an easy one that you think would be easy, but it's often frustrating. We see going in, stop implementing technology before looking at your processes. A lot of times we're brought in when technology is implemented and they spend a lot of money on technology, but they didn't engage in a process review first. Often, the process review will help them determine what path they need to go to in technology. And looking at how they utilize their workforce is so critical before they can just implement a piece of technology. Frankly, I wish people would just step back and think about what kind of issues do we have going on right now in our processes. Can they be tighter? Can they be better before implementing technology?
At first, I thought you were going to say stop implementing technology just for the sake of grabbing technology, because sometimes you see that
Yes.
happen as well.
Me too.
So, what are some of the most progressive practices that are going on right now that, maybe if you could just even say the top couple
Sure.
of practices that people seem to be either gravitating toward naturally or they see it happening?
One item that is really starting to come out with people working remotely, in addition to that, people making multiple changes internally, whether it's technology, whether it's processes, whatever that is how to deal with change management. Over the last 2 years, we've seen more agencies want to think through what change management means and how that impacts what they're implementing. Um, because a change management process, we do a lot of this now, where change management process isn't just a fancy term, but it's actually thinking through how to plan and analyze, how to design, how to build and test, and then how to deploy and transition, whether you're transitioning workforce and transitioning processes. Um, and we're grateful that our clients are starting to want to think through that, because you can just throw a piece of technology out there, but how you plan that change is so critical of whether people buy off on it, people accept it overall and utilize it. And if you don't process that change appropriately, it could fail. And we're seeing more of that as sort of a best practice now. So that's one area. Training programs, we've talked to clients for a long period of time about how training programs internally are so important to grow your staff, right? It should be a no-brainer, but we are now seeing more and more that succession planning is so critical, as we see retirements, as we see staff leaving after 2 years now. It's becoming more of a norm. So getting the training internally set, if you will, is really important to drive success of the organization. So having a good training program and learning how to deal with change management are two areas that I think are real important for agencies to look at.
And you would never have a private sector, management or a manufacturing company or, any biochemistry company or, even a plastic, polymer company, roll out changes without having those two crucial pieces of change management. They'd have all the practices, documented and training. And so, to have public sector organizations not have those within their management toolkits, it might be a new concept for them and it's very needed, but it's also in the private sector that's been there as one of their core foundations for so long.
Right.
So it's good to see that those are being within the progressive toolkit of management, but it's also really a long time coming in most regards.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that with the training on Quad Health side, right? That's it. Training is becoming more of a norm, and it should be, recognizing the value of training.
And professional development it's not a one and done scenario that you don't have to address it and you have to keep coming back for more. I want to touch on one of the things that you mentioned when you talked about the retirement numbers and some of the labor analytics here, because within affordable housing, it's getting to be harder to hire in certain places that have been traditionally easier. And we're starting to see the turnover is high in the field right now. And then you have this pandemic that has awkwardly impacted labor dynamics. And at one point, I heard you say that over 70% in the affordable housing industry, the employees are over the age of 40. So what do you think, if you could make a prediction, what does that mean for the future of this profession?
It's a great question because it's really critical to note that we are losing a lot of talent in housing authorities due to retirement. And we're noticing that there's a drop off in some of the talent that's more universal. CEOs that can go and think through development, property management, HCV, all of those critical areas. And finding that talent now is becoming a smaller list. And so what we've talked to clients about is continuing to create a succession plan internally that will look at those high performers, those people that stand out, and create development programs for them so they are able to not only be your second in command, but that person that can step up to the plate and have not only learned about resident services, but all those other areas that are really critical, including resident services, finance, all those things that are pivotal to being a CEO of a housing authority. The hiring process for the CEOs in the last 2 to 3 years has become tighter, harder to find those CEOs. We are taking people from the private sector. It is working, but it's a longer learning curve for those individuals. And so if we can grow people internally and move them up through succession, it's a whole lot easier in the short term of just giving them a development plan and watching them thrive in the long term.
Do you think it's still a candidate-centric market, or has that all changed this year?
It has changed. We do a little bit of recruiting, mostly when our clients say, you know us so well, so will you help us out? But the recruiting we do provide is mostly on the executive side, director on up. And we're seeing a lot of highly qualified people enter the market. Interesting enough, and sadly, we're seeing a lot of nonprofits that are obviously not doing well during the pandemic, and it's pushing those executives out and looking in the market. It's really right now, the housing world is going to have, well, probably at least over the next 6 months or longer, ability to hire at least director level and up. It'll be a lot easier.
Okay, let's take a pause here, Jason. Coming up in part 2 of my interview with Jason Geno, President of Human Capital Initiatives, Jason will tell us how he helps leaders think creatively about vision.
You can work with them and coach them on different methodologies of being visionary, but they have to get there. You can give them the tools, you can show them what a SWOT analysis does, but if they can't grasp strategy and vision, but merely strategy, then that's problematic.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.